Hello everyone, and welcome to CT Talks with Premier Brains. In today's episode of Knowledge Sharing Q&A sessions on UAE Corporate Tax, we'll be discussing the free zone person taxation under UAE. Recently, the Federal Tax Authority published the Corporate Tax Guide regarding the free zone persons in UAE. Now, you may consider this as an extension to episode 4, where we have discussed the corporate taxation of free zone persons in UAE. In today's episode, we'll elaborate more on the conditions that are required to be met for a free zone person to be classified as a qualifying free zone person, and the activities that are classified as excluded or qualifying activities. Now, with that note, let's get started and inform our viewers how they may comply with the qualifying free zone person regulations and the methodology to be applied to classify their activities. My first question to you, ma'am, is can you summarize to our viewers all the conditions which will be discussed in brief in order to be classified as a qualifying free zone person?
So hello everyone. Federal Tax Authority has come up with a very comprehensive guide, to explain the rules about the free zone regime, what are the conditions which need to be met by the free zone persons, what are qualifying activities, what are non-qualifying activities. It's a complete detailed comprehensive guide which has been issued. So your question on what are the conditions to be classified as a qualifying free zone person. So first is they have to be a free zone person to be a qualifying free zone person. So free zone person meaning a juridical free zone person which has been established or incorporated in a free zone in UAE. And when we say juridical person incorporated in the free zone, the qualification will only apply to their business which is in the free zone business. So for example, if a juridical person, let's say, has a branch outside the free zone, then the 0% benefit will not apply to that business which is outside the free zone of that particular branch. So what are the main conditions is they must be a free zone juridical person, they must derive qualifying income, they must have adequate substance, and they should comply with arm's length principle, they should comply with transfer pricing documentation, and they should have audited financial statements, and they should elect not to be subject to the normal corporate tax rates, and also the non-qualifying revenue which they earn must meet the de minimis requirements, which is basically 5 million or 5% of the total revenue, whichever is lower.
What does adequate substance mean, and what are the factors that determine the qualifying free zone person status?
Okay, so when we say a qualifying free zone person has to meet minimum substance requirements in the free zone, we mean to say that they should have a significant economic presence within the free zone. The idea is to ensure that they are conducting some genuine business operations within the free zone. So the adequate substance can be determined by various factors. One of it is like a physical presence. So the free zone person must have a proper physical office or other kind of facilities in the free zone. They should have adequate number of employees which are consistent with the level of activity which they are doing. And those employees should have the relevant qualifications and experience to be able to perform the activity. The other condition is that the core income generating activities must be conducted in the free zone. So which are the revenue generating activities for the business which are core to their business operations must be conducted within the free zone, and they should have adequate level of expenditure to be incurred in the free zone entity, which demonstrates their actual genuine business operations within the free zone. So we can say physical presence, adequate number of employees, then core income generating activities, and then adequate level of expenditure. It is important to be, bear in mind that this will be judged on a case-to-case basis. There is no threshold which is set that what is adequate, whether 2 employees are adequate or 5 employees are adequate. It has to be judged on a case-to-case basis depending on the nature of the activity which the business is doing and also the level of operations which they have. So it could be possible that 2 employees is sufficient for a certain nature of business, but for another nature of business, 2 employees is not sufficient. So the businesses have to make their own judgment, and also keep a documentation to support that the substance has been met.
Can you advise which all transactions and activities are eligible for the 0% rate under the free zone regime?
0% beneficial regime is intended to apply to the transactions and activities which are performed within the area of the free zone, including the designated zones. And those transactions can arise from various sources, being a qualifying income, which will include transactions which are done with other free zone person who are the beneficial recipient of those transactions, unless they relate to the excluded activities or they relate to any immovable property which is located outside the free zone or any non-commercial property which is in the free zone. Other transactions which would form part of the qualifying income is the income transactions which are conducted from qualifying activities, again which should not be excluded activities, income from qualifying intellectual property which a free zone person has developed, or any other income which meets the de minimis requirements.
What are the qualifying activities?
Okay, so if a qualifying free zone person sells goods or services to a non-free zone person, then it can still benefit from the 0% corporate tax regime if those transactions are conducted in respect of these qualifying activities. So these are like manufacturing of goods or materials, processing of goods, then trading in certain qualifying commodities, ownership, management and operation of ships, wealth management services, investment management services, reinsurance services are there, logistics services are there, then also the distribution of goods or materials in or from designated zone, then headquarter services to related parties, treasury or financing services to related parties, financing or leasing of aircraft. So all these kind of activities form part of qualifying activities in respect of the free zone regulations. And qualifying activities also include actually the ancillary activities which are necessary for the performance of the main qualifying activity. And it should be so closely related to the main activity that it cannot be considered as a separate activity. So if these conditions are met, then even the ancillary activities will also qualify as a qualifying activity.
Can you elaborate more on what constitutes as ancillary activities?
Ancillary activities will need to be considered on a case-to-case basis depending on the main qualifying activity which is conducted by the free zone person. So first of all, it has to be necessary for the performance of the main activity. And what we need to see is that is it like so integrated to the main activity that if we disrupt this ancillary activity, then the main activity cannot be performed. So it cannot be really detached from the main activity, otherwise it would affect the functions of the main activity. And it should be a support to the main activity. It should not be like an activity which can be a core activity in itself or a separate activity. It has to be like a support activity to the main activity, then only it will be considered as an ancillary activity. So let me give you an example here where something cannot be considered as an ancillary activity. So for example, let's say a business has some surplus funds. So instead of returning those funds back to the investors, the business decides to keep it for future use and invest those surplus funds for future use. So this investment of surplus funds cannot be considered as an ancillary activity. So the investment of funds has to be considered as a activity in its own right. So it can be considered as a qualifying activity, for example, when it is treasury or financing services provided to the related parties. So or otherwise, it will be considered as a non-qualifying revenue for the de minimis calculation purpose. So very important to see which activities you are classifying as ancillary activities, as there could be in some cases a very thin line. So a very careful judgment needs to be undertaken on this front.
So previously we had discussed that the 0% tax rate would apply to transactions between free zone persons. Over here, can you discuss the concept of beneficial recipient?
Okay, so we discussed that the 0% beneficial rate will apply to transactions with other free zone persons where the person is the beneficial recipient of those goods or services. So this condition has been put into the regulations to prevent the abuse of the rules. So 0% benefit will only apply if the other free zone person who is the purchaser is the actual beneficial recipient of those goods. When we say beneficial recipient, it means that the purchaser, which is the other free zone person, should be enjoying and using those goods and services and should not be bound by a further contract or a legal obligation to supply those goods or services to another person. So he must be enjoying the goods or services himself. But it should not be like he's acting only as a conduit or a intermediary company in between, like an agent or nominee for someone, for another third party. If this is the case, then that third party will be the beneficial recipient and not the free zone person. So whenever a qualifying free zone person is having transactions with other free zone person, he needs to ensure that the purchaser is the actual beneficial recipient. So what can be done is that in these cases, there needs to be a documentation which needs to be kept, which can be in the form of an undertaking letter or the written statement by the purchaser that he is the actual beneficial recipient of those goods or services.
What are excluded activities and why are they significant for a qualifying free zone person?
So excluded activities would be considered as non-qualifying revenue, and these are important to be considered because this can lead to losing of the qualifying free zone person status of a free zone company. So what are the kind of excluded activities? These include any transactions with natural persons other than those transactions which are related to ownership, management and operation of ships, then fund management services or finance or leasing of aircraft. Other than this, any transactions with the natural persons would be considered as excluded activities. So for example, if there is a free zone company which operates a restaurant in a free zone and it is selling to the individual customers, because those individual customers would be natural persons, so this would be considered as an excluded activity since the transaction is with a natural person. Any banking activities would be considered as excluded activities. Any insurance activities, except if those relate to reinsurance or captive insurance. Any kind of finance or leasing activities, except if those relate to ownership management or ship operations, financing or leasing of aircraft, or any financing services to related parties. And the other case of excluded activity could be the ownership or exploitation of immovable property, except if the immovable property is located in the free zone and the transaction is with other free zone persons. So these are some of the list of the excluded activities which needs to be kept into mind when you are looking at your non-qualifying revenues.
Prior to the guide being announced, there seemed to be a lot of confusion regarding the activities related to distribution of goods or materials. Can you elaborate more on this?
So one of the qualifying activities which is there in the corporate tax law for free zone beneficial regime purposes is distribution of goods or material in or from designated zone. So the guide has clarified in a very elaborate manner on this front. So when you say distribution, it means procuring the goods or transporting the goods from the, let's say, a manufacturer, storing the goods, inventory, doing the inventory management, and then transporting those goods to the customer. So the key point here for distribution, which differentiates it from logistics, is that the distributor holds the title to the goods. So that is one point. if we are doing these activities, then these activities should be done in or from the designated zone. And if the goods are entering UAE, then those should be imported through the designated zone. And one important point which is here is that those goods needs to be sold to a reseller or someone who processes these goods for further resale purposes. So the customer should not be an end user. So the qualifying free zone person has to do a proper KYC to ensure that the customer is a reseller. So that this is one area which has been clarified in quite detail in the guide. The another area which was of confusion earlier was about high sea sales. So what will happen to the high sea sales? So it has been clarified in the guide that if the company is in a designated zone and is conducting these kind of distribution activities, and even though the goods are directly going from the manufacturer, which could be in an X country, and directly going to a Y country customer who would be a reseller again, but those goods are not moving through UAE, those would still qualify to be a qualifying activity, provided those are, those activities are from a designated free zone company. So this has been clarified in the guide.
With that said, we come to an end to today's episode of CT Talks with Premier Brains. We hope today's episode could provide more clarity to our viewers regarding the free zone person corporate taxation and the compliance requirements. So stay tuned, and we'll be back again with yet another exciting episode with another interesting topic about UAE corporate tax. Till then, thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you so much, everyone.